12 Army trucks do not usually turn onto Larkspur Lane. Nothing about our cul-de-sac in Miller's Creek, Ohio was built for engines that size, for the low diesel rumble that rattled misses. Henley's wind chimes 3 houses down, for 24 soldiers in uniform stepping out onto pavement that had never held anything heavier than a UPS truck. My mother's hand went to her throat. My father set his coffee down so hard it cracked the saucer, and I stood on the porch where, a year and a half earlier, they had told me to get out, holding my daughter on my hip, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not even vindication exactly, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before you finally get to say a true thing out loud in front of people who can no longer pretend not to hear it. But to understand why an army convoy was idling in front of my parents' house on a Tuesday morning, you have to go back to the winter I turned 20, when I stood in that same doorway with a very different kind of arrival. A suitcase, 6 weeks of sleepless nights, and a baby girl asleep against my chest. And my father told me I had until noon. I'm Kayla Whitfield, and before any of this happened, I was the kind of 20-year-old nobody worried about. I did the books for my father's hardware stores, 3 locations across the county. Whitfield Home and Hardware painted in green block letters over every one of them. Ever since I was 16 and good enough with a spreadsheet that he trusted me with the register reconciliations other employees kept botching. I noticed when a decimal point wandered. I noticed when a number that should have stayed the same didn't. It is a strange skill to have and not yet know that you will need it for something much bigger than inventory counts. My father, Robert Whitfield, was a deacon at Miller's Creek Community Church and about as concerned with what the church parking lot thought of him as he was with anything else in his life. My mother, Diane, ran the women's ministry, organized the casserole rotation for anyone who'd had surgery or a baby or a death in the family, and had opinions about all, 3 that she rarely kept to herself. We were not a loud family. We were a family that handled things quietly, at home, behind a closed door, and then walked into church on Sunday like nothing had ever been discussed at all. I used to think that was simply how families worked. I did not understand yet that quiet can be its own kind of violence. I met Eli Navarro in October. At a bonfire 2 of my girlfriends dragged me to out past the county line. He was 22, stationed 40 minutes away, home on a long weekend, too, see his mother, and he spent the first 20 minutes of that bonfire arguing with my friend Priya about whether a hot dog counts as a sandwich, with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for arguments that actually matter. He'd worked on trucks before he enlisted. His family ran Navarro's Auto on the east side of town, the side of town my father referred to, without much subtlety, as over there. And something about the way he talked about engines, patient and specific, the way I talked about numbers, made me feel like maybe I wasn't the only person in Miller's Creek who paid attention to things other people didn't bother to notice. We dated for 7 months, mostly on weekends, mostly in his truck, or at the diner on Route 9 that stayed open until midnight. He learned that I liked my coffee black, and my plans confirmed twice. I learned that he called his mother every single Sunday without fail, no matter what else was happening, which told me something about him before he ever had to say it out loud. Once, in February, he drove 2 hours through a snowstorm because I had mentioned, almost as a joke, that I had never actually seen the ocean, and he did not take me to the ocean, obviously landlocked as we were. But he drove me to the biggest lake he could find within 2 hours and stood next to me on the frozen shoreline in 20-degree weather so I could at least say I had seen something that big. That is the kind of specific I mean when I say I paid attention. I still have the photo he took of me that day, squinting into the wind, looking happier than I remembered feeling in a long time. My father met him exactly twice and shook his hand both times like he was checking it for something. My mother was politer about it, which in our house was not the same thing as warmer. Once, that spring, I overheard my father telling my mother that Illy was a nice enough boy for right now, the way you'd describe a rental car, and I remember feeling a small, cold certainty that my father had already decided Illy would not be part of any future he was picturing for me. By April, I knew I was pregnant. I took 3 tests over 2 days because I did not trust the first 2, which tells you something about who I already was. I did not accept a result until I had checked it more than one way. I told Ali on a video call, watching his face do something complicated, and then settle into something steadier than I expected from a 22-year-old. He said, and I remember the exact words because I turned them over so many times afterward. Okay, we're doing this together, then. He asked me to marry him 3 weeks later over the phone, badly, nervously, in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely. I said not yet, not because I did not want to, but because I wanted us to build something real first, on our own terms, not something rushed together out of fear of what my father would say about the order things happened in. I have wondered since whether that hesitation cost us more than either of us understood at the time. I told my parents on a Sunday afternoon in May, 5 days after my 20th birthday, at the kitchen table where I had eaten every meal of my childhood. My father did not raise his voice. That was never his way. He set down his fork, looked at me for a long moment, and said, "You have embarrassed this family in a town where our name is on 3 buildings." My mother did not say anything at all. She got up and started clearing plates that still had food on them. There is one more piece you need before the rest of this makes sense, because it matters later, more than I understood at the time. 2 years before any of this, my grandmother Louise, my father's mother, had died and left me something specific in her will. $9,400, held in trust until my 20th birthday, with a note to the estate attorney stating that the money was for Kayla's independence whenever she needs it, and no one else's opinion about when that is. She also left me a cardboard box of her old letters and journals, which sat unopened in my closet for 2 years because grief made me unwilling to look at it yet. My father had never liked that she'd done that. He'd said once, at her funeral, lunch, that his mother always did love to have the last word. I did not understand until much later how right he was, or how much that last word would end up mattering to me. Illy deployed in June, 10 days after I told my parents, on what was supposed to be a 9-month rotation. We said goodbye in a parking lot outside his base, and he put both hands on my stomach, which barely showed anything yet, and told me he would write every single week that he could. I believed him completely. I had no reason not to. My parents let me stay through the pregnancy. I want to be fair about that because it would be easy to tell this story as though the door slammed the day I told them, and it did not. What actually happened was slower and in some ways worse. I was not allowed to go to the bonfires or the birthday parties, or even most weeks to church with them. "Let's not make a spectacle," my mother said more than once, as if I were the spectacle, and not a 20-year-old having a baby the way people have had babies since the beginning of recorded time. My car keys disappeared into a kitchen drawer for insurance reasons. My cell phone got folded into a family plan dispute that somehow always took one more billing cycle to resolve, until I was making calls on the landline in the kitchen, usually with my mother 2 rooms away pretending not to listen. Nora was born on a Tuesday in January, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and Elie's exact stubborn chin, which I recognized the second the nurse laid her on my chest, even though I had never once seen him actually cry the way she was crying right then. My mother came to the hospital. My father sent flowers and did not come at all, which at the time I told myself was about his schedule at the store. I was allowed to stay in my childhood bedroom with Nora for 6 weeks. On a Thursday morning in late February, while I stood at the counter warming a bottle, my father came into the kitchen already dressed for the store, poured his coffee, and told me, in the same, even voice he used to read scripture on Sundays, that it was time I figured things out on my own. He said a single mother under his roof sent a message to this town that he was no longer willing to keep sending. I asked him what message he thought a 20-year-old with a healthy baby and a steady job actually sent. He did not answer that. He looked at his watch instead and told me I had until noon. I did not cry in that kitchen. I want to be honest about why. Because it was not strength exactly. It was that some part of me had already started keeping a ledger, the same way I kept the ledgers at the store. And a ledger has no room for tears, only entries. I packed 2 suitcases. I packed Nora's things into the diaper bag and a laundry basket. My sister Bethany, 16 at the time, stood in my bedroom doorway with her arms wrapped around herself and did not say a single word. And I understood even then that she was frightened of something bigger than just watching her sister leave the house. I called Ruth Kowalski, who I knew from the store she had been coming in for 40 years for hardware and gossip in roughly equal measure. And I had done her books for her late husband's small engine repair business before he passed. She had a 1-bedroom apartment above her garage that she had been meaning to rent out for over a year. She told me to come right now, that the rent was $340 a month with utilities included, and that she had kept a crib in her attic since her granddaughter outgrew it 11 years earlier. I did not know yet that Ruth would become one of the most important people in my life. I only knew, standing on my parents' porch at 11:45 that morning with a 6-week-old baby and everything I owned in 2 suitcases, that someone had finally said yes to me without a single condition attached to it. I want to tell you what the next 7 months actually looked like, because it was not a montage set to music. It was a spreadsheet. I moved into Ruth's apartment above the garage, 1 bedroom, a kitchenette, a window that looked out over her vegetable garden, and a radiator that clanked so loudly the first week that Nora startled awake every single time it kicked on. I got a job at Miller's Creek Feed and Grain doing their books 3 days a week, $11.50 an hour, 30 hours if I was lucky. Because the owner, a woman named Pat who had known my grandmother, did not ask questions about why the Whitfield girl needed outside work instead of just showing up at the family store like everyone in town expected. Ruth watched Nora on the days I worked in exchange for whatever I could pay her, which for the first 2 months was mostly nothing at all, and she never once brought that up to me. Pat had a rule, which she told me on my very first day, that nobody at Miller's Creek Feed and Grain was allowed to ask me about my family, my situation, or the father of my baby, not because she did not care, but because, in her words, "You're here to do a job, and you do it well, and that's the whole conversation." I have never in my life been more grateful for a boundary. It let me be a person who was good at something again, instead of only a cautionary tale getting whispered about over coffee hour. There was one night in May I still think about more than almost any other. Nora spiked a fever past 103 at 2 in the morning, and I had exactly $41 to my name until payday, 3 days away, and I sat on the bathroom floor of Ruth's apartment with a screaming, burning baby in my arms doing the math on whether urgent care would take a payment plan before I had even called them, because that is what the months after you get kicked out actually feel like. Not one dramatic collapse, but 100 small, private arithmetic problems nobody else ever sees you solve. Ruth heard Nora crying through the floor, came up in her bathrobe at 2 in the morning without being asked, and drove us to urgent care herself, and paid the copay before I could stop her, and told me in the waiting room, not unkindly, that she had raised 3 kids on a mechanic's income and knew exactly what $41 felt like in a person's hand. Nora had an ear infection. She was fine within a week. But I remember that night specifically because it was the first time since my father closed that door that I let myself cry, quietly, in a plastic waiting room chair, and it did not feel like weakness. It felt like the ledger finally balancing for one single night. I want to tell you, I spent those months writing to Ellie constantly, and I did, but I want to tell you something else too, which is that I stopped hearing back. His last letter had arrived in early August, 4 pages, funny and specific, describing a card game he had lost badly and a care package from his mother that had melted completely in transit. And then nothing. No letter in September. No letter in October. I told myself deployments were unpredictable, that mail got lost, that he was somewhere without access for a stretch. By November, when 3 more months had passed in total silence, I told myself something harder, that he had had time to think, states and an ocean away, about a 20-year-old with a baby and a family that clearly did not want either of them, and that he had made a decision I could not entirely blame him for, even though it broke something in me just to think it through to the end. I did not chase him. I want to say that plainly, because I know how these stories usually go, and mine did not go that way. I put my head down. I did Pat's books, and then Ruth's books, and eventually 2 more small businesses in town that had heard I was reliable and cheap, which in a town of 6,000 people turns out to be a very effective form of advertising. I learned, too, stretch $11.50 an hour across diapers and formula and rent. And by April, I had exactly $180 sitting in a savings account. I did not touch even on the weeks it would have been so much easier to touch it. I read Grandma Louise's letters at night after Nora finally went down, 1 or 2 at a time, because I still was not ready to read all of them at once, and I found out things about her I had never known. That she had married my grandfather at 19, that he had controlled every dollar that passed through their house for the first decade of their marriage, that she had hidden small amounts of grocery money inside a coffee can behind the flour for 6 years before she had finally saved enough to feel like a person with choices instead of a person waiting on permission. One letter, addressed to no one in particular, and dated the year my father was born, said only this: I will not raise a daughter who thinks this is what love is supposed to look like. She never had a daughter. She had my father instead. I have wondered more than once whether that is exactly why her trust came with a note saying it was mine whenever I needed it, and no one else's opinion about when that was. Tucked into that same letter was a small, square, yellowed photograph of Grandma Louise standing in front of a coffee can on a kitchen counter, half smiling at whoever was holding the camera, like she already knew that decades later a granddaughter she never really got the chance to know as an adult would need proof that the coffee can had been real, and that getting free of something quietly still counts as getting free. The first real inconsistency I noticed, and I do mean noticed, because bookkeeping trains you to see that something does not add up before you understand why it does not, came in June, 4 months after I had left. Bethany came by on a Saturday with a box of my old things from the house, things my mother had apparently finally decided to pack up rather than keep taking space in the garage. Near the bottom, underneath a stack of my old textbooks, was a small, unopened package addressed to me, postmarked the previous September, with a return address I recognized immediately: Carmen Navarro, Illy's mother. The tape had been cut once and resealed with a different, cheaper roll than the original packaging had used. Inside was a hand-knit baby blanket, yellow and soft, and a card that read in careful handwriting, Kayla, we don't know what's happened between you two, but we love this baby no matter what. Our door is always open. Love, Carmen. It had never once been opened by me. It had been opened, read, and hidden. I did not say anything to Bethany that day. I only asked her, as casually as I could manage with my hands shaking behind my back, whether she remembered anything else like that, packages, letters, anything at all arriving at the house that fall. She went very pale and very quiet and said she needed to go, and I let her go because some instinct, the same one that had learned patience from a ledger, told me that pushing her right then would only close a door I needed to stay open a little longer. It took 2 more months to get the rest of it, and I got it in pieces, the way you always get the truth out of a family that has had practice hiding it. In July, at the grocery store, I ran into Illy's cousin Marisol, who I had met exactly once, the same night I met him. She looked at Nora in the cart, looked at me, and said, careful and a little cold, "We heard you didn't want him around anymore, that you'd moved on." I told her that was not true, that I had not heard from him since August of the previous year, and I watched her face travel from cold to confused to something close to alarm. She told me Carmen had gotten a call from my mother sometime that fall, saying I needed space, and that the family would appreciate it if the Navarros did not reach out for a while, for my sake. Carmen had passed that along gently, in a letter, not wanting to add stress to a deployment already stretched thin. Illy had written fewer letters after that, and when the ones he did still write got no answer, because I never received them, because they were sitting in a shoebox in my father's workshop, which I did not know yet but was about to find out. He had stopped writing at all, hurt in a way that finally made complete sense once I had every piece of it laid out in front of me like a reconciled account. That same week, I finally worked up the courage to knock on Carmen's door myself, 18 months later than I should have. She opened it, saw me standing there with Nora on my hip, and simply started crying before either of us had said a word. Her kitchen smelled like cinnamon and motor oil, which I would later learn was just what happened when you lived above an auto shop your whole life. And she sat me down at her table and showed me a photograph Illy had mailed her from deployment that I had never seen. The two of us at that very first bonfire, laughing at something out of frame that he had apparently kept folded inside a letter to his mother the whole time we were together. She had been told, she said, that I wanted nothing to do with any of them. She had spent an entire year respecting a wish I had never actually made. I went home that night and sat at Ruth's kitchen table with a legal pad, the same kind I used for Pat's books, and I wrote down every date I had. The last letter I had actually received, early August. The package that never reached me, postmarked September, opened and hidden. The call to Carmen, sometime that fall, according to Marisol. My cell phone, folded into a family plan dispute for weeks that same summer, exactly when Ali would have been trying any line he could get access to. I am not a person who believes much in coincidence when every coincidence points the same direction on a calendar. I believed, by August, almost a year to the day since Ellie's last letter had actually reached me, that my parents had not simply let a relationship die of ordinary neglect. They had ended it quietly, with one phone call and a pair of scissors and a resealed roll of tape, and then let me believe for a year that it had died on its own. Bethany called me in late August, past midnight, crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She was 19 now, about to start her second year at the community college, and she told me that a week earlier, looking for a socket wrench in my father's workshop. She had found a metal filing box shoved behind a shelf of paint cans, and inside it were roughly a dozen envelopes, most already opened, all of them addressed to me in handwriting she recognized from the birthday cards Illy used to send before he deployed. She had photographed every single one with her phone before putting the box back exactly where she found it, terrified our father would notice it had been moved even an inch. She sent me the photographs that night, one after another, and I sat on Ruth's kitchen floor at 1 in the morning with Nora asleep in the next room, and read a year and a half of a man's handwriting getting slowly more confused and then slowly more distant. And I understood, reading it, that I had spent a year mourning something that had never actually ended between us. It had only been stolen, one envelope at a time. I did not call my parents that night, or the next day, or even the week after that. This is the part of the story people sometimes struggle to understand about me, and I do not particularly need them to, but I will explain it anyway. I did not want a confrontation I could not win, and I could not win a confrontation armed with only feelings. So I built a file instead. I photographed every letter Bethany had sent me. I got a short, notarized written statement from her, at her own insistence, describing exactly what she had found and when she had found it. I requested our old family phone, plan records from that period, which took 3 separate phone calls and a fee I genuinely could not afford, and found precisely what I expected to find. Incoming calls in September and October from a number I did not recognize, routed through a military family communications line that our home phone had received and that no one had ever once mentioned to me. I put all of it into a physical folder because a folder cannot be quietly deleted the way a text thread can. And I labeled it exactly the way I labeled every client file at Pat's office, by last name, Whitfield. And then I did the one thing I had not let myself consider for months, because I was afraid of what it would mean if it did not work. I wrote a letter, not to Illy directly, since I did not have a current address and did not trust that anything sent through channels my parents might still be able to touch would actually reach him, but to his unit chaplain, whose name and contact information Carmen gave me that same week. I wrote 4 full pages, explained the situation as plainly and as calmly as I could manage, and asked if it was at all possible and appropriate that the information be passed along to Specialist Navarro directly, and only to him. I did not know, when I sealed that envelope, that it would reach him with 6 weeks left in a deployment that had already been extended twice, or that he would end up reading it standing outside a mess tent and have to sit down hard on an ammunition crate to finish it, or that the very first thing he would do afterward was walk it over to 3 guys he had been complaining to, on and off, for over a year about a girl back home who had apparently stopped writing for no reason he could ever quite work out. I only knew, mailing it, that I had finally done everything a person with evidence and no power actually can do. The rest was no longer up to me. Illy's unit rotated home in early September. He called me from the airport, and I almost did not recognize his voice at first. It had been so long since I had heard it live. Instead of read it off a page, rougher, a little older, and also somehow exactly like himself. He did not waste time on small talk. He said, "I read the chaplain's letter. I saw Bethany's pictures. I've got 11 days of leave, and I am not spending a single one of them being polite about any of this." He drove to Miller's Creek 2 days later, not alone. He had told the story over the better part of a year, in the particular way soldiers tell each other things during long stretches of boredom and stress, to guys who had become the closest thing he had, to brothers. Somewhere in one of those conversations, he had mentioned something my father had said to him the one time they had ever spoken directly, back before the deployment even started, when Ellie had tried, awkwardly and sincerely, to tell my father his intentions were serious. My father had looked at him. Illy told me this part later, sitting at Ruth's kitchen table, watching my face carefully as he said it, and told him that a Navarro from the east side of town would never really be part of a family like ours, and that he should not bother coming back around unless, and this was the exact line, unless he brought the whole army with him. My father had meant it as a joke at Illy's expense, the kind of joke a man like my father tells when he wants to hurt someone without leaving fingerprints. Illy never repeated it to me at the time, because he did not want to give it any more power than it already had. But he never forgot it either. And when 9 of his guys heard the whole story laid out, the letters, the intercepted calls, the year and a half of silence that was never actually silence, just theft, 6 of them, on their own time, in their own personal vehicles, decided they were driving to Ohio with him. Not on orders, not for show, because that is simply what you do for someone who showed up for you first, and nobody had to explain that twice to a room full of soldiers. That is how 12 vehicles ended up idling on Larkspur Lane on a Tuesday morning in September, Illy's truck at the front, 5 army pickups behind it, most of the guys still in uniform because they had come straight from base and had not bothered to change, and my father standing frozen on his own porch, watching a small motorcade of men he had once dismissed as unworthy pull up outside his house because his own daughter had needed backup he had refused to give her himself. It was 71 degrees that morning, the kind of early September day that still smells like summer if you do not look too closely at the leaves already starting to turn at the edges. Mr. Petraki's 2 doors down was watering a lawn that did not need watering, openly staring. A woman I did not recognize, out walking a beagle, simply stopped in the middle of the street and stayed there. I remember thinking, in the strange, detached way you notice small details during the most important 5 minutes of your life, that Larkspur Lane had never once had an audience before, and it had one now. I was there that morning by a strange coincidence, and also not. Exactly. Bethany had asked me to come by that afternoon to talk things through. A phrase my mother had been using for weeks, trying to negotiate some version of reconciliation that involved me quietly returning to the family on the family's own terms, without too many uncomfortable questions about what had actually happened the year before. I had brought the folder with me. I had not told either of them that. I brought it because some old instinct, the same one that used to catch a wandering decimal point before I ever understood why it mattered, told me I might need it that day. I did not run down the driveway toward him. I did not cry. I walked to the edge of the porch, with Nora on my hip, and I watched Lee step out of his truck in his dress uniform. And for a second neither of us said one single word, because 18 months is a long time to save up a sentence, and no sentence felt big enough yet to spend it on. He walked up the porch steps, looked directly at my father and said, "I got your message. Took me a while, but I got it." Then he looked at me and at Nora, who was staring at him with the wide, unblinking curiosity of a baby meeting a total stranger who somehow does not feel like a stranger at all. and something in his face broke open in a way I do not think I will ever forget as long as I live. My father tried to recover the way he always recovered, with volume and certainty. He said this was a private family matter, and that Ali had no standing to bring an audience to it, gesturing at the trucks, at the neighbors, already drifting out onto their own front lawns, to see what an army convoy was doing on a residential street at 9 in the morning. That was my moment, and I did not raise my voice either, because I had learned that particular skill from him. Ironically, the one useful thing I ever really learned from my father. I opened the folder. I told him, in order, the way I would walk a client through a reconciliation. The resealed package from Carmen, postmarked the September after Nora was born. The phone records showing 3 calls that September and October from a military family communications line, none of which I was ever once told about. Bethany's notarized statement describing the filing box hidden in his own workshop. Photographs of 11 letters dated across 14 months that had never once reached me. I did not accuse him of anything. I simply read him the ledger out loud on his own porch in front of neighbors who by then had fully stopped pretending they were not watching. My mother made a sound I had never heard her make before, something between a gasp and a sob, and sat down hard on the porch step, both hands pressed flat over her mouth. My father's face did something I had also never seen it do. Not anger exactly, though there was anger somewhere in it. Something closer to a man watching a number he had been completely certain of turn out, on closer inspection, to be wrong. He did not apologize that morning. I want to be honest about that too, because these stories like to hand you a clean ending, and mine did not hand me one on the porch. What he did instead was go quiet, which from my father was its own kind of confession, and walk back inside the house without another word, leaving my mother crying on the front step in front of 11 soldiers, a granddaughter she barely knew, and a daughter who had finally stopped waiting for permission to say out loud what had actually happened to her. The weeks after that were not a fairy tale, and I think it matters to say so plainly, because the fairy tale version is the version that makes people stop believing stories like mine could possibly be true. My father did not become a different man overnight. For close to 2 months, he barely spoke to me at all, and when he did, it was in the clipped, formal way you would use, with a business contact, not a daughter. Word got around Miller's Creek the way word always gets around a town of 6,000 people. Not because anyone announced it, but because 11 soldiers parked in a cul-de-sac is simply not a thing that stays quiet, and because Marisol and Carmen, and even Pat down at the feed store, all had their own version of the story they were willing to tell anyone who asked. A few of the men my father golfed with on Saturdays started finding reasons to reschedule. Somebody left a casserole on the old porch. My mother told me about it later, half laughing and half not, with a card that just read, "Thinking of you," and neither of us ever did figure out which side of the story it had come from. My father's business did not collapse, and I want to be honest about that too, because I do not think a satisfying ending actually requires it to. Whitfield Home and Hardware kept its doors open, kept its green block letters, kept most of its regular customers, who mostly minded their own business, the way small towns like to pretend they do, but rarely actually manage. But something in how people greeted him at the counter changed, subtly, the way a number changes when you round it the wrong direction one too many times in a row. He noticed. He has never once said so to me. He did not have to. My mother was the one who actually tried to make it right. She showed up at Ruth's apartment 3 separate times before I finally let her in on the 4th, and the first thing she did, sitting stiffly at my little kitchen table, while Nora reached curiously for her earrings, was cry in a way I had genuinely never once seen her cry before. Not managed, not performed for an audience, just raw. She told me she had grown up terrified of Grandma Louise's judgment, that Louise had never fully approved of her, that she had spent 30 years married into a family that measured love by how well you protected its reputation, and that when I told her I was pregnant at 20 by a boy from the wrong side of town, some old, ugly, inherited fear had taken over before she had even had time to think through what kind of mother she actually wanted to be. It did not excuse what she did. I told her that plainly, and she did not argue with me even once. But it helped me understand it, and understanding is not the same thing as forgiving, though it is usually the road you have to walk down to eventually get there. Bethany and I grew closer than we had ever been, which is its own strange gift buried somewhere inside all of this. She had carried real guilt quietly for a long time, the way 16-year-olds carry things they do, not have the power to fix on their own. And when she finally found the courage to hand me the truth, it cost her something at home that I do not think she has ever fully told me about, even now. I made sure she knew more than once that she never owed me the risk she took on my behalf. She told me she did it because somebody in that house needed to finally stop being quiet, and it was not going to be either of our parents. Ellie's leave ran out 11 days after the convoy pulled onto Larkspur Lane, and he went back to finish the last 5 months of his contract, which felt, after everything, almost anticlimactic. Just a long-distance relationship again, except this time built entirely on the truth instead of a silence neither of us had actually chosen. He came home for good the following spring. He did not re-enlist. He went to work at Navarro's Auto alongside his father, and within a year he had talked his way into managing the books right alongside the wrenches, which meant, for a while, that I was teaching a mechanic how to read a balance sheet at our kitchen table after Nora went down for the night, and I have never loved anyone the way I loved him during those small, unglamorous evenings. We got married on a Saturday in June, in Ruth's backyard, underneath the same maple tree Nora had napped beneath in her stroller 100 times that first summer. Ruth gave a toast that made almost everyone cry, herself included, which she insisted afterward had been allergies and nothing more. Carmen cried through the entire ceremony and hugged me so hard afterward, I nearly lost my footing in the grass. My mother came and helped set up folding chairs all morning and cried quietly in a way that finally felt honest instead of performed for anyone watching. My father came too. He stood near the back for most of it, and at the very end of the night, as people were starting to say their goodbyes, he found me by the dessert table and told me a little stiffly that Nora had gotten his mother's exact chin, and that Louise would probably have liked Illy, eventually. It was not an apology. From my father, I am not sure a complete one was ever actually coming. But it was the closest thing to one he had, and I decided, standing there in my wedding dress with frosting on my thumb, that I was allowed to accept it as enough for that particular night, even if it would never quite be enough for everything that came before it. Bethany stood up with me that day, too. In a pale green dress she picked out herself, and cried harder than anyone except possibly Ruth, and told me afterward, half joking, that finding that filing box in Dad's workshop was the most important thing she had ever done with a Saturday afternoon. I believe her. She finished her degree in early childhood education last spring, and Nora was the very first kid she ever officially babysat solo, which Bethany still brings up like a professional credential. She is the one Nora asks for now when she is scared of a thunderstorm, which is a strange and wonderful thing to watch happen between two people who once stood on opposite sides of a locked door, neither of them by choice. Nora is 2.5 now. She calls Ruth Jiggy and already has strong, specific opinions about which shoes she is willing to wear on any given day, which I recognize, with some alarm, as exactly the kind of opinions I used to have about spreadsheets at her age, or close enough to it. Ruth says she has got my mother's stubbornness and her great-grandmother Louise's chin, and delivers that information the way she delivers most information, without waiting to see if anyone actually wanted it. I run my own small bookkeeping business, now out of what used to be Ruth's sunroom. 6 clients as of this spring, including, as of a few months ago, Whitfield Home and Hardware itself, which my father asked me to take on personally, over the phone, in a call that lasted 4 minutes total, and ended with him saying, almost as an afterthought, that he trusted my numbers more than anyone else's he had ever hired. I do not know if that is the whole apology I once thought I needed from him. I have mostly stopped waiting to find out. I have a family that showed up for me with 12 trucks and 0 hesitation, and I have learned, the hard way, that the family you are born into and the family that actually shows up for you are not always the same people, and that the second kind is the one worth building an entire life around. I think about that morning on Larkspur Lane sometimes. The sound of engines idling on a street that had never heard anything quite like it before. My mother's hand at her throat. My father's coffee cup shattered at his own feet. I think about what it means that the people who were supposed to love me without any conditions needed a literal army to finally believe I was telling the truth, and that the people who owed me nothing at all showed up before I even had to ask twice. If you had been standing on that porch at 20 years old with a 6-week-old baby and a suitcase, I wonder what you would have done differently, and what you would have done exactly the same. I would genuinely like to know. Tell me in the comments where you are watching this from tonight, and if stories like this one mean something to you, stay a while. There are more of them here, and I plan on telling every single one I've got.